Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our weekly Bible study. Today, I'm not at one of the facilities. I'm here in my apartment and enjoying the scenery that I have here, missing out on seeing some of my friends, but glad you're able to join us for this weekly Bible study. We've been doing a series on the life of Elijah. We're probably going to spend the rest of this month there, and then Rochelle actually gave me the title for the next one. We're going to call it Paul and Friends. So starting in April, we're going to do a whole series about Paul, but focusing more about the people that he kind of hung out with, people that we may not know that much about. And some of them have some very interesting lives that we want to share with you. So, but let's get into today's study. So let's do a quick review here about what we looked at last week. So Ahab, who is kind of the main character, he's obviously the antithesis of Elijah. So there's these two main characters, good and bad. He marries Jezebel, and the purpose of that marriage was to cement an alliance between the northern kingdom and the neighboring city-states. We call it the Phoenicians, but they really called themselves by Sidonians or from people from Tyre. Those were city-states in an area that's now modern Lebanon. And the purpose of that alliance was primarily economic. Up until this point, the Phoenician city-states had had a close ties with the southern kingdom through David and Solomon. But the northern kingdom was wanting to expand its influence, obviously ensure that their neighbors would not bother them. And so, which was customary in the ancient world, they would form these alliances through marriage, much like the Europeans did with the nobility marrying, so that, you know, the king, the nobility of Germany were related to the French or the English or even the Russians. And they thought that through these marriages, they would keep the peace. Well, again, the northern kingdom wanted that relationship with their neighbors, and so Ahab married Jezebel. Jezebel introduces Baal worship when she comes into the kingdom. And at that point, because of the introduction of Baal worship, God sends Elijah and declares a judgment that there would be no rain for the next several years. Soon as that announcement is made, God then sends Elijah to hide him from Ahab near his hometown, east of the Jordan River. We looked at a map last week to see kind of where that was at. And while for a short time, about a year, that's where he stayed, kind of in isolation and solitude, where he had access to water, and God sent ravens to bring bread to Elijah. But about a year later, the brook dries up. And so this was not going to be a long-term situation that Elijah was going to be able to stay here. So God sends him off to another land. But the lesson we learn in that first kind of experience of Elijah was this valuable lesson of trusting God. And we mentioned this statement last week, but I think it's a powerful statement that I want to remind all of us about again, that God wants us to trust him, not be trusting in what he provides for us. We love God's provisions, and God provides so much for us. In fact, I've been doing a series on stewardship, and we're talking about that all that we have, our life, our ability, our talents, our family members, all those relationships are part of what God has provided for us. But we can spend our time focusing on what his provisions are, and we miss sight of the fact of the provider of those provisions. And so Elijah learns a valuable lesson because God has provided. He's provided food, the bread by ravens. He's provided the water from the brook. And all of a sudden, those provisions are gone. Will Elijah now focus on his loss of provisions, or is he going to focus on the God who provided those provisions? Well, we know the story. He turns to God, and God then has another plan for him to move him to the next level. And that's where we get into today's lesson. So then the word of the Lord came to Elijah and said, go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon. Ooh, he's actually sending him into the Phoenician territory. So here he's been kind of on the eastern edge of the northern kingdom, on the east banks of the Jordan River. And now God is sending him across the northern kingdom to the western end of the territorial line of the northern kingdom, near the city of Sidon. And he says, I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. Now, two things that just leap out at me when I read this verse. Number one, Elijah is not finding shelter or protection inside the northern kingdom. He's finding his protection outside the northern kingdom, and that God's provision is going to be from a widow who is not Jewish. This widow is going to be of the Phoenician area. Now, is it possible that she's Hebrew and living in this area? That's always a possibility, but more than likely she's not Hebrew or Jewish. She is a foreigner that is going to provide for Elijah. So Elijah is instructed. Now, the Zarephath is interesting. The name means to smelt or to melt or refine. It's as if God is sending him to an area to refine him, to put him in the crucible. Peter picks up on this imagery in 1 Peter, where he talks about that we go through difficult times. We go through the crucible, the furnace, the fire, to strengthen us, to test our faith, to see what it is made out of. Is it made out of, that we trust God's provisions, or are we trusting God through the midst of those difficult things? And so in essence, Elijah is going through that same refining process. He went through his first test and he seems to have passed it well. Now he's going through a second test where he's being sent into a foreign land, and he's going in an area where he is going to be further refined by God. And this is what he's doing. He is to leave a place of hiding and move to the area of all places that Jezebel is from. Interesting. Now, Zarephath is about 75 plus. Depends on how you travel. Could be closer to 100 miles, but it's 75 plus miles from Cherith. So this is going to take him a while, because he's more than likely he's walking there. And again, he's going through open territory, open country, and there is the potential that Ahab still has the bounty on him and wants him killed. And so he's still hiding from all of the forces of Ahab. Now, before we go into the story, what happens when he gets to Zarephath, I just want to point this out, that God's provision is moving from ravens to a poor widow. Again, I find that most interesting. Here he had ravens taking care of him. Now he's not finding a place of plenty. He's going to a woman, a widow, in fact, who is impoverished. And we're going to find out how impoverished she was. She was coming to the end of her literal rope. And so God is going to use these meager things, ravens who are scavengers, a widow who is approaching the end, to provide the provision for Elijah's life. So let's move now. So when Elijah comes to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he went to her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have drink? As she was going to get it, he called out, oh, by the way, could you also bring me a piece of bread? Okay. So by her response, we know that she was going to be able to give him water. Obviously, she was going to go to the town well, or whatever, where the town got its water. She was going to get water for him. You say, well, why would a foreigner do that? Remember, in the Middle Eastern culture, the hospitality was important for strangers that came through a town. and that it was expected that you would take care of people that you didn't know, at least through the night, so that they could move on. It was the hospitality of the desert, or the nomadic type of culture. And so this wasn't totally something that should have surprised anyone. But the fact is, he adds to it. Not only do I want water, would you bring me a piece of bread? So here's Elijah. He observes. Now, he doesn't know she's penniless, but he probably could assume that, because in that day and time, widows typically were at the lower economic status of society. So here is this widow person, this lady, penniless, gathering sticks. What he's going to find out later is her final meal. He doesn't know that yet. He just sees this woman, widow, gathering sticks. And what was he thinking? Well, Elijah wasn't really thinking about her at all, was he? He was famished. He'd been traveling through the desert for days. And we don't know what provisions he had. And so it's possible that he had gone without a whole lot to eat over these days that he's been traveling through the countryside. And so he comes and he asks for water. And water she can do, but bread? And look, notice what she says. As surely as the Lord your God lives, notice she didn't say Lord my God, our God, Lord your God lives, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. And I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and then die. So now Elijah gets the full story. He sees what he perceives as a widow, assumes, rightfully so, she's probably not a wealthy individual, and he asks for water, but he goes on further. Now, what's the basis of him asking for this? Because here comes the test. I mean, could you and I ask someone for food when we know it's going to be their last meal? I know I would have a hard time. But here's, I think, where the test is. God had told Elijah that she would be his provision for food. And now the question is, I've got conflicting information. I've got God who's told me that a widow is going to take care of me. I now find this widow. I ask for her, and now I find out that she is so impoverished that they're ready to eat their last meal and die. That was not what God had told him. He didn't know that. And so now what is Elijah going to do? Is his feelings for this woman, his compassion for this woman, override the fact that God had told him that this lady is going to provide for you? Or did he step back and say, I don't see with natural eyes how this works out, but I'm going to trust God that when he says this woman is going to provide for me, she's going to provide for me, even though my physical eyes don't see that possibility. I don't know about you, but there have been times when I've run into that, where I have a sense that what God is asking me to do, and then I look at the physical situation and I see, wow, this doesn't line up. Do I let my physical eyes dictate what I do, or do I step back and say, but God said he was going to take care of me in this situation? And it was so clear that I just knew in my heart that this was of God. Of God. Test. And I think people of God, we've reached those points where we say, do we really trust the provider, or do we trust the provisions? So we see that this testing of Elijah is kind of being ratcheted up. So let's move on and look at the test. So Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Not be afraid of Elijah, but don't be afraid of the circumstance we're in, because she had to have been shocked when this guy, Elijah, asks for food on top of it. He then tells her, go home and do as you have said. But first, okay, so what had she said? She was going to go make a meal for her and her son. And he says, go home and do that. But before you do that, just make a small loaf of bread for me. Again, when we think of loaf of bread, we're thinking of the kind we buy in the stores. Loaf of breads were probably only a few inches, long and maybe an inch and a half to 2 inches. They were very, very small portions of bread, kind of like what you would eat in one meal. And that's how they would make bread. So he says, a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. But here is Elijah's faith. And I have it underlined in red. And then make something for yourself and your son. So the first test comes to Elijah. He's confronted with an impoverished woman who doesn't have anything. Is he going to stay true to what God had asked him to do and come and meet this woman? And now the woman is faced with the test. Am I going to trust what this man of God is saying to me, that there will be enough for me and my son after I make something for him? So again, she's thinking there won't be enough, but Elijah's telling her by what he says, there will be enough. Okay. And again, I think we all have had times in our lives we've been faced with this where we know in our heart that it's going to be all right, but we have no idea how God's going to do it. But we just trust him. I don't know how I'm going to make it through today. Some of you have faced difficult things if you've lost precious loved ones and you're not sure how you're going to make it through today. But the point is that even though I don't know how, I trust God. I believe in him, that somehow he's going to help me through this experience in my life, this difficulty that I'm facing. Again, Elijah and this woman now are both being tested. Are we going to trust God in this whole situation? Well, let's move on with the story. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar, now this is Elijah continuing. He's just told her, you go ahead, make a small loaf of bread for me, and then make something for your son. And then he says, the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry. So now he's giving her a word from the Lord. And then he puts a limit on how long this provision is going to last, until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. Now, two things come to mind as soon as I read that phrase. Number one, it is highly likely that the reason why she's so impoverished and near death's door is because of the drought. There hasn't been anything for them. Their crops have failed. And so there's been nothing for them to provide the provisions for them to eat. And they've been using it up, whatever they had in store. Second is, this was not a forever story. It wasn't like God is going to provide forever. There was a season of God's provision that he was providing for this woman. And that's true in our lives. You know, sometimes God provides incredible things, kind of like he did with the children of Israel. For the 40 years they were traveling to the wilderness, God provided manna. God provided quails when they were complaining about the manna. God provided water. God provided all kinds of things, direction in their lives. But the day came when that provision ended. That didn't mean God gave up on them. It said God was going to do a new thing in their life. He was going to lead them in new ways. He was going to provide for them in new ways. So what God is saying through the prophet to the widow there is, I'm going to provide daily for your sustenance. But the day will come when the rains will come and you'll have to go back to gathering the crops and making the flour and doing all these other things. So what did she do? She went away and did as Elijah had told her. And so there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. So maybe more than just the son. Why? For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jar of oil did not run dry, but in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. Every day was an act of faith. Just like the children of Israel, every day for 6 days when they would go out and gather the manna, they only had enough manna for that day. Every day there was just enough flour, just enough oil for whatever the food requirements were for that day. And then the next day was another day of faith. daily walking with God. And I think it's such a beautiful lesson that we learn that God provides for us what we need for that day. He doesn't give us a bounty that will last us for the next 5 years. We have to trust God that he will give us what I need today. And I'm so thankful for that. And so we see the interdependence. She provides for Elijah, and God provides for her. I love that. I love that. And that's the divine partnership, is many times you and I are God's answers to someone else who may be struggling. I'm not talking necessarily about financial or they don't have food. We're just talking about there was a need. They need someone to come in to encourage them or to pray with them. And you may be God's solution. And I find whenever I go and minister to people, many times I walk away minister myself. So she demonstrates faith by giving all, and God multiplied it. Every day, as I said, was another miracle. And this is going to last for 2 years. It's going to last for 2 years till we come till the rains finally start coming. So what are some lessons? Number one, God's leading is often surprising. And the fact is we just need to trust him, not overanalyze it. And it doesn't look the same by individuals or by circumstance. I think back to how God, directed and provided early on in our marriage. This year will be year 48 that we've been married, Judy and I. And I look back at his provisions, and I don't know that God has ever done exactly the same way. I look back at this past year and how God has provided, what we needed when we needed it. And so I tell my students and I tell people that walking with God is like riding a roller coaster. You just hang on because it's going to be exciting. There's going to be some thrill moments and you're going to say, oh, did they see that coming? But God is going to hold us in and just trust him. The second thing I learned is the beginning days are often the hardest. Hey, that first day, is God going to provide? But we got to hang in there. Don't quit. The Bible, particularly in the New Testament, talks about that we need to persevere in our walk with God. And so this is true of habits, that we need to persevere. If you want to develop a new habit, you need to do it constantly for 21 days. I was just sharing that with my students. And I said, and then we just need to keep at it, persevere, because we can get into old patterns. And that God's promises often hinge upon our obedience. See, that's our part. We want God to provide, but we somehow want God to provide, and we forget the fact that he wants us to be obedient, to trust him, because we're in this divine partnership. Another lesson is God's provisions often are just enough for that day. So let's not fail to thank God. I mean, we are blessed in a culture and society where we're really not worrying about where our next meal is coming from. But think about how many millions, tens of millions, who there's no certainty of what their next meal looks like or when the next meal would be. And so when I have that meal in front of me, there is an appreciation. God, I thank you for what you have provided for me today. I have no certainty we have my tomorrow, but I thank you for what I have to. May we be grateful people. And we make it through each day. Now, I want to share a story, and I've kind of put it here, is how God provides in different ways. Many years ago, when Judy and I lived here in Springfield, Missouri, we were wanting to buy a dining room set in Springfield. We had a house and we had a dining room in it. It was an older home, and we wanted something that when the family came and the youth group came over, we'd have a place to sit. And the church was in the midst of a fundraising program for a new location. So we wanted to buy a dining room set. The church was in the midst of raising funds. And we told the Lord as we were praying about it that we wanted, that we had $800 and that anything less would be given to the building fund. Okay, that's kind of how we did it. We said, we need this thing. We didn't feel like we wanted to give all 800, but we were saying to the Lord, Lord, listen, we're going to trust you. We're going to provide. I'm not sure how much a dining room is going to cost us. And so we got this $800. And so if we're able to get it for less than $800, that's what we want to give, at least starting out, as our contribution to the fundraising program. Well, I won't go make a long story too long, but there was a place here in town that was going out of business on Glenstone, for those who live in Springfield. And it was kind of like a warehouse type of thing. And so it had gone out of business before we could get the set bought. And so we decided, I was in school at the time, in seminary. And so I took the day off and we went to the auction to see if we could find a dining room set, pretty inexpensive. We knew what we wanted. And after a whole series of maneuvers that were just God moments, we ended up getting that set for $250. Now, I would love to tell you that I joyously gave the $550 to the building program, but I have to admit to you that maybe it was a little bit more Pharisaic, because I had a hard time letting go, because I was thinking about all the other things that here this newly married couple could use in getting started. And I think I missed the blessing. Now, Judy, my wife, she got the blessing. I think because of my attitude, I missed the blessing that God had provided something that we felt was important. And yet it was much, much less than we ever anticipated. We thought we were going to have to spend almost all the $800. It turned out we only had to spend $250, and we were able to give a large amount. Now, I will tell you this. I think I would have been less of the person if I hadn't been faithful to what God had called, because what God did really was, he was testing me. Would I be true to my word? And even though my attitude maybe wasn't exactly what it should have been, I wanted to be a person of my word. Simple story. Speaks volumes about God provided. He provided for two situations that weren't really connected to each other, but because of me, they become the connecting point. And I think God does that when you and I are led by the Lord to do something, many times it's not only for us that God is doing a work, but also for somebody else that is also doing a work. And I love the way God does that. Well, let's move on here, because there's another test to come. Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house that he was staying in became ill, and he grew worse and worse and finally stopped breathing. And she said to Elijah, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" So here we know it's been going on for probably another year. He's been living with her a year. Things have been going well. Every day's been act of faith. But then tragedy strikes, and all of a sudden, the woman lashes out at Elijah. So what's Elijah going to do? What are you going to say? Because here was this poor widow who's now lost her offspring. That was like the center of her world. And what is Elijah going to do? Well, again, most of us know the story. He says, "Give me your son." He took the boy from her arms and he carried him. So he's probably not that old a boy, maybe an elementary age. Okay. Or could have been younger. Carries him to the upper room where he was staying. Upper room was always the second floor. That's usually where the guests stayed. The first floor was maybe where the main family stayed or where they kept their animals. And so he takes him up to this upper room and lays him on his bed. And then he cries out to the Lord. The word cry there was a travailing, just an earnest prayer. Okay. This is not a quiet, passive exchange between Elijah and God. And he says to him, crying out, "Lord, my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" Okay. So Elijah's not pulling back. Remember, I told one thing about Elijah. He's bold. He's even bold with God. He's basically saying, "God, what are you doing? What are you doing? I came here and we're grateful that you've provided, but why did you take the son? And so he says, I'm going to pray. I'm going to believe God for a miracle here. So then he stretches himself out on the boy 3 times and cries out to God, wailing, just crying out to God, oh God, let this boy's life return to him. And he does it 3 times, not just once. I know some people, well, God's not deaf. I don't need to be, going over and over. God says that what he looks for in us is persistence, not because he doesn't hear us, because he wants to find out, do we really care? Is this really important to us? And Elijah's saying, this is important, God. This lady has taken care of your servant. And this life is gone. God, do the impossible and perform a miracle. Then the Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house. And he gave him to his mother and said, look, your son is alive. Your son is alive. Now, as I'm reading this, I'm actually seeing something for the first time I never caught before, that he carries the boy down. Does that mean that we're dealing with a preschooler here? What's going on here? Is the boy still in a weakened condition? Don't know the details there, but we know that Elijah just doesn't send the boy down. He doesn't call the mother up. He goes down and he basically hands the boy and says, life has now returned to your son. Here, your son is alive. And look at what the woman said. Now I know. I suspected. I kind of knew, but now I know with absolute certainty that you are a man of God, man of Jehovah, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. Wow. So not only does she recognize that Elijah is a man of God, but she also is recognizing that when he speaks, he's speaking truth. Oh, would that be said of all of us, that when we speak truth. Not necessarily in a prophetic way, although that would be appropriate, but that when we speak, people can rely on our word. We're trustworthy in our words. That when we say we're going to do something, it's as good as done. When we say we're going to pray, we will pray until the Lord answers that prayer. May we be people of our word. Let me close with some thoughts here as we wrap up today. Life is like a pruning, a testing, a refining. John chapter 15 says that we are the branches, God, Jesus, is the vine, and that there are times in order to produce greater fruit, greater productivity in our lives, that the vine's individual, the person who takes care of the vineyard, he goes and she goes and prunes off some of the branches in order to get a better productivity. That cutting off, that refining is not easy. It sometimes is difficult. And in fact, it's interesting that the word cherith, where he first went, means to cut off. And then he goes to a place of refining. And I think it's not by accident that we have these 2 words that speak to what was happening in the life of Elijah, that he was being pruned, he was being developed. Yes, he was a man of God, but he still had much to learn about trusting God, because there's a great miracle that's about ready to take place. But notice that prior to that great miracle, God's also taking him through some difficult times. He's building up his trust and reliance and confidence and faith in God. And so now, about a year after staying with the widow, he's come to this place of refining. She becomes ill. And of course, as we shared in the story, she begins to blame him. And she goes in that anger phase of the stages of grief. And she resentment, if we're not careful, towards God now focuses on Elijah. And I want to pause there as we look back at that part of the story, is that Elijah becomes the object of her anger. How could you do this? How could your God do this? He's directing. There have been times, I'm sure there have been family members that have been lashing out They've been dealing with an issue, and you were the first person that came across their path, and they lashed out at you. This is when we got to step back and give grace. Because sometimes it's just that we're the person in the room. It's not really about us. It's not really about us. There's other things going on here. And that's exactly what happens. But notice what Elijah did. Elijah didn't get upset. He didn't try to preach at her and everything else. And he just has confidence there. And what was his response? Silence. No defense. He's not trying to justify what God did or didn't do, not trying to justify himself. He knew this woman was in intense pain. What do you say there? Hey, what are you thinking? Even if you thought you had an answer to give this is not a time for sermons. This is not a time for speech. This is the time just to be silent and to be there. Okay? Just to be there. Because life happens and there isn't always good answers to it. So what does he do? Instead of speaking, he just says, here's what I can do. I can pray. And he goes and he prays, and life returns to the boy. And what I love, the fact is that the awe, the reverence, the honor doesn't go to Elijah. It goes to Elijah's God. And so what happens is God receives all the honor and glory. Elijah is God's instrument in helping this lady through a most difficult time. And I just see a simplicity in Elijah's faith. I don't know what to say to this woman. All I know to do is I can pray. I can pray. A little gutsy on his part, I have to admit. But the point was, he basically said, God, this isn't right. This isn't right. And he intercedes. He intercedes. There's sometimes that we need this type of intercession for other people, maybe family members, where we intercede and say, God, been faithful. We've done everything you asked us to do. We don't understand. We know that everything is to your honor and glory. We ask, Lord, that you would intercede and do the impossible. Again, we're probably talking about a preschool or elementary age kid. Whole life. This is going to be the person that's going to take care of this widow in her old age. This was huge because widows didn't have a safety net. And God, Elijah says, I'm going to pray. I'm going to intercede. Not only is Elijah's faith, does it grow, but obviously the life of this widow. She proclaims that God is good, that God is great, and that he is the living God. As we close today, I want us to see two things that I want to take away from this story. One is that before we do major things for God, God takes us through some tests. He prepares us for those big events. You and I don't know what our tomorrow is. We don't know what that looks like. It could be joyous, it could be heavenly, or it could be filled with tragedy, heartache, because as we live this side of eternity, that's what our existence tend to look like. So we don't know what our tomorrow is. We do know who holds tomorrow, as the old song says, and we know who holds our hand. And so what God does is he takes us through, some through the water, some through the fire, some through the flood, but all with God with us. And so maybe that's what you're going through. You're going through a series of tests and you're saying, why these tests? This doesn't make any sense. Because again, maybe God is getting you ready for something that's going to be even greater, where you can trust him for even greater things than you've ever trusted him before. The second thing I take away is that God is not afraid of us saying, God, something's not right here. We need your help. And cry out to God with passion and intercession and say, God, please do a work here. I don't pretend to know what the answer looks like, but I know who has the answer, and that's in my living God. Thank you again for being part of this series on the life of Elijah. we're now ready for that big event that we're going to talk about next week that God's been preparing Elijah for. But what a lesson of trusting God that Elijah and the widow learned as they looked to God. Father, just go with us now. May we just keep trusting you. Even when we don't understand, Lord, we trust you. We know that, Lord, you do all things well, even in the midst of difficult times. Keep us safe as we come back together next week, as we continue this incredible story about Elijah. Thank you, Lord, for your word. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you all and have a great, great day.